Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula, and we're here to get you ready for the Las Vegas Grand Prix and one of the most unique races of the year.
It's time to fully push for those points as we've not got enough time to budget increase anymore. And who knows, can Mercedes continue their form from Vegas in 2024?
The home stretch of the season starts right now. We're going to start today with something we predicted in our second half preview, and that is Kimi Antonelli is on fire right now. You can see on your screen over the last 5 races, he has 121 fantasy points, which is similar to that of George Russell and Lando Norris, and more than Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc, and Lewis Hamilton. Now, in that same stretch of races, his values increased 1.8 million, and it culminated in a career best P2 finish and 40 fantasy points at Interlagos. So, Zach, the question is, at a track that's been very favorable to Mercedes these last few years, can Kimi Antonelli keep it up?
I really do think he can. It's going to be really interesting seeing the percentages go up for how much he's owned this weekend, because I expect coming into Vegas that Mercedes will be looking on fire. But Antonelli's still in this interesting phase, which is quite awkward to fit in your teams because he's not cheap enough to be a proper B tier driver, and he's not expensive enough to be like an attractive A tier premium driver. So it's sort of a little middle ground. So he works perfectly for teams that have a cost cap in the 120-ish millions. But everyone else, it's sort of, well, who do we get rid of? Is Antonelli going to be better than a Norris in Vegas? If we're looking at it historically, Mercedes here, probably yes, but that sounds like a big risk. I really do think Antonelli could be that differential coming into this weekend that everyone is looking to try get in, even if it does mean that we have to get rid of someone like potentially a Norris or a Piastri or a Verstappen, or maybe even a Russell if he continues his form from Brazil.
And so you can see we have a few options here on how you can get some of those Mercedes assets in your lineup. We've also got some other really creative options at the end of the show in our team selection section, so you won't want to miss that. There are, starting at the very bottom of the budget range, you can just bring in Norris, Antonelli, McLaren, and Haas. I've got a lot of good things to say about Haas and their recent form, so that's a good point of entry if you want some Mercedes assets. Then if you move up a step to 125.8 million, that's where you get Norris, Antonelli, McLaren, and Mercedes. So you get a piece of the constructor and a piece of one of their drivers. And then as you move up to 130.6, you can have Norris, Russell, Antonelli, McLaren, and Haas if you want a really cool differential with 3 top drivers. So these are the cheapest points of entry using the cheapest drivers on the grid for the rest of your teams.
Now, heading into Vegas, I really want to dial in on 2 key constructors heading into this race weekend, and it has to be McLaren and Mercedes. So initially, straight away, we can think of McLaren as the set foundation of our teams, purely because McLaren this year have just averagely just been a very fast car. Even at tracks that fully didn't suit them, they were still fighting to both be in the top 5. So I'm very excited to see what they can do here, if they can improve on their Vegas form of recent years. But both drivers have been into Q3. Out of all of the races so far, that's 210 points just from quali teamwork points alone. They've had 11 fastest laps. Norris has had 16 podiums, which is just consistency, which I think is one of the most important things in F1 fantasy. We've seen it with the likes of Russell as well, where having just a consistent key driver is absolutely fantastic. And they've also had 2 straight wins. So even if their car doesn't look fantastic potentially, Norris is in brilliant form right now. Maybe he can push McLaren a little bit more. And actually, talking about Russell, that's where we look over at Mercedes, because like I mentioned, Russell consistent as well. He's only had 2 finishes outside the top 7, 0 DNFs, which again is very, very important in F1 fantasy, as that minus 20 could really, really hurt you. But again, Mercedes, the cheapest of the proper A-tier drivers, not including Williams, and right now, they're looking better than Red Bull and Ferrari. So I think it is very clear heading into this race weekend that it's McLaren and Mercedes that everyone should really want to have as a foundation on their teams.
We've been tinkering around with our drivers for the last few weeks, but we finally settled into a meta constructor pairing. And if you look at the Global League Top 500, 98% of those teams run McLaren, 95.8% of those teams run Mercedes, 4.4 took a chance with Red Bull, and 0.8% had their hearts ripped out of their chest with Ferrari at Interlagos. So you can see the top 500 is converging on these two teams as well. And Zach, you talked earlier about the number of podiums that Lando Norris has scored this season. He can tie in this race for the 10th most podiums ever in a single season in Formula One. So that's how consistent he's been. And with George Russell, now he's at this point where we can count on him for 20 to 25 points each and every week. Antonelli has had an improved form these last few races, and now McLaren and Mercedes are two of the only teams throwing both drivers into the top 5 or 6 each and every race. So for me, these two teams are locked in.
And then also, don't forget that you can still join the Russell Rivals Mini League. Just remember, it is a league that has been going on since Mexico and it will end in Vegas. So one last chance to join into this league. And just remember, there are some really very, very fun prizes coming out. Like I mentioned before, I'm very, very excited about the first place prize. I don't think I'll get it, but a George Russell signed pair of boots, I just think is really cool.
And as you're thinking about what team to run this weekend, all three Mercedes assets stand out in their own mini league. So keep an eye out for our buy column when we get to our tier rankings in just a little bit.
And then for the chips heading into Vegas, it is getting very, very interesting for what you can and can't use, because at the end of the day, if you have free chips available, you're going to be wanting to use one of them at every single race weekend. Now, in Vegas, it's looking a little bit interesting. I think autopilot potentially could be a very good option, with Mercedes looking quite fast, with Norris being in the form he's in, with Verstappen being in the form he's in. It could be a lot of up in the air of who's actually going to bring in the most points, especially if you have like a Norris, Russell, Antonelli team like we showed before. Autopilot could be a brilliant use there. But I do think if you've got Limitless, get it done there. If you've got Final Fix and something goes wrong, you can use it there. If you've got Wildcard, I'd highly recommend it as well, heading into, of course, that sprint race weekend in Qatar. So Vegas is going to be an exciting weekend for chips to see what everyone does. And it's a lot of setup for potentially Qatar, where extra DRS looks like it could be king.
This is going to be such a unique race because the temperatures are going to be lower than we've seen them in months. It could get as low as 40 degrees Fahrenheit and single digits Celsius. So getting the tires warmed up and in the right operating window is going to be crucial. That autopilot could be a big help for you. So now let's check out our tier list. And for the 2X driver, it really comes down to Norris versus Verstappen. They've been going back and forth these last few weeks, either winning races or outscoring the winning driver. Betting lines have Verstappen slightly ahead of Lando entering the week, so he has that edge. But the real story in the betting lines are that the Mercedes drivers are P3 and P4 ahead of Piastri and the two Ferraris. So that goes to show you how much Vegas believes in Mercedes at the Las Vegas Grand Prix this weekend. So that one's really big for me. But there are also a few important drops in Tier A. For one, there's nothing Ferrari can do to convince me to run them this week after the debacle at Interlagos. And considering his form in recent weeks, there's also nothing Oscar Piastri can do to convince me to ever run him again in these final races. Even if he picks up that momentum to get back into the World Drivers' Championship, I can't be truly confident that he'll outperform the guys in the buy column this week.
Then heading into the budget options, I actually want to start off with the sell category first, purely because of that driver there of Fernando Alonso. He's in a really weird, interesting place where I do think if you can afford to take him out, if you have that extra transfer to take him out, that's not a -10, and the only other driver you have to get out is Fernando Alonso. But at the same time, I would also argue a little bit for him being on the fence, purely because even at 4.5 million, we're getting to that point in the season where Alonso didn't have the best Brazilian Grand Prix. But if there is one, I think there's a couple of drivers out there, Alonso, Behrman, I guess Hulkenberg, because we've seen it as well from Hulkenberg, Albon, that I think that's about it, who I could see a B-tier driver getting 30 plus points in a weekend. So I always would love Alonso just as an asset, purely for he's got that Alonso effect of potentially always could bring in a few more points than anyone else. But budget, he's going to hurt you. But that doesn't matter too much these days. Then we head up to the fence options. And this is where it starts getting a little bit interesting, because I actually think Isaac Hadjar is a half-decent option. It's just he's the lowest of the half-decent options. We'll see what Racing Bulls is like. I expect them to have a little bit of pace here. Like they've had quite a few tracks, but I'll wait and see for the practice results for someone like Isaac Hadjar. And then I think the interesting one is Bortoleto as well, because sadly, I think if you have him, you've got to get rid of him. That negative in Brazil just really hurt him too much. And then into the buy category, I think the main one, if you can afford to bring him in, which a lot of people will if they have a lot of Mercedes assets, is Behrman. Behrman has been an absolutely brilliant form of recent. Mexico and Brazil were absolutely phenomenal races. Back to back, absolutely brilliant races from him. I expect him to have another good showing in Vegas. Sainz looks good for potentially getting in those points or budgets. Both Alpines now, obviously Colapinto at the points threshold. Gasly actually skyrocketing in the 5 millions. It's been a while since we've seen an Alpine not on the price floor, so it's very, very interesting to see him there. Albon, always a pretty good option. Again, though, he's a little bit awkward to bring into teams. And then Antonelli has to be the top option for this weekend. How he's still getting 0.6 millions and the points he's getting in because he's below that threshold, incredible. If you can bring in Antonelli, I would highly recommend it.
And just to put some stats behind that Behrman point you made earlier, Zach, he has 36 points in each of his last 2 races. Now, assuming his overtakes from Brazil will stick. To compare that with George Russell, a guy that we've said is super consistent all season long, he only has 2 races all season where he scored 36 or more points. Behrman's done that in the last 2 races. So really, really great form for Ollie. Never enough love for Alex Albon. 9 double-digit scores in his last 10 races, but still his ownership rates are fairly low. And also for Gabriel Bortoleto, he needs 24 or more points to not lose 0.6 million. So while I'm not a huge fan of chasing little cost cap gains here and there, this is a guaranteed 0.6 million loss and will impact your flexibility in the final 2 races. So I'd move him out. If you haven't already, please make sure to like the video. It does a world of good for our channel. And also keep an eye out for our memberships where you can get this video before anybody else. I want to give a special thanks to our 2 newest members, Devin and I Don't Even Know. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. So let's bring it all together and talk about the top lineups for the Las Vegas Grand Prix, starting with a team that I call the flavor of the week, because you're going to have the most popular constructors in McLaren and Mercedes, a guy that's won 2 races in a row in Lando Norris, George Russell, who's Mr. Consistency on the grid this season, Ollie Behrman on back-to-back 36-point weeks, and then 2 veterans in Sainz and Gasly who have been on the rise over the last few weeks. So this team costs $138.4 million, so this is a little bit in Zach territory. It's gotten a bit expensive, but you can bring Behrman down to one of the cheaper drivers on the grid and run double Alpine. You can go from Russell to Antonelli and bring this team to $131.8 million. So there are a few options to bring it down to most other price ranges.
Yeah, I absolutely love this team. One other point you could change around is Sainz to Hadjar. Hadjar still is just about usable on the budget, which is fantastic because I think he can come in with a few decent points. And if you're like potentially like 0.2, 0.3 million away from Sainz, this is where a Hadjar would come in handy. Same thing applies if you're really struggling with B-tier drivers and Verstappen looks really good in practice, which I actually think he could. Then Verstappen and Russell isn't actually a differential option this race weekend. So we might have a situation where we have McLaren as a constructor, but no McLaren drivers, but it would still actually work. So very excited to see all of the different teams heading into this race weekend.
With our second team, we're having a little fun with this, and we've called it Maximum Mercedes because this is one of the few options where you can get Lando Norris and both Mercedes drivers into the top of your team. But to do that, you'll run the Haas constructor instead of Mercedes. This team costs $133 million, but we haven't talked enough about the Haas constructor. Since they made those upgrades in Mexico, they've scored 45 and 60 fantasy points respectively in the 2 races since. So maybe they've really taken a corner. I trust Haas this weekend, and if it gets you this fun differential, I'd say go for it.
So now, if you really, really are chasing any differential right now, if you're like me, where maybe you had a last few weekends where it hasn't really gone your way, but you've got big, big budgets, this is where I would go. 0 McLaren, and I genuinely think this is the final chance for you to go 0 McLaren on the teams, because Qatar and Abu Dhabi will be better. But at Vegas, if McLaren don't look as strong, it's very much doable to go Verstappen, Russell, Antonelli, Alonso Colapinto, you have to go with the cheapest assets there, but Red Bull and Mercedes. Now, I don't know if I have enough courage to go over from McLaren to Red Bull, but if we had Verstappen winning this race with both Mercedes in the top 3 as well, this would end up outscoring the other generic teams by so much. Do I actually think it will? No. But if you're chasing that differential, if you just need something different to work with, to just try, it's all or nothing now, this is the team I would go for.
And we hear this a lot. We have listeners of this show that are in leagues where they have more budget than the teams ahead of them in their mini leagues, but those teams ahead of them are running the classical Norris, McLaren, Mercedes lineups, and they need a differential. So I think this is a huge opportunity, especially when you look at McLaren's history at Las Vegas. Lando has a DNF here. Piastri's never podiumed here. I don't think Norris has ever podiumed here either, come to think of it. So it does open the doors for the likes of Verstappen and Red Bull to really rip away a lot of points if history repeats itself.
I'm excited. I genuinely think some people will use that too.
Yeah, sometimes you, like, as Zach would say, risk it for the chocolate biscuit. We gotta start throwing some weird ones out there.
Now, heading into the last team you could potentially look around, again, it's more on the differential side, but I think it works more for people who are at this price range because you really have to push at everything possible. And it really just revolves around if Mercedes are going to be fast at Vegas like last year. If they are, I genuinely think you could have 180 a driver of Russell, then you could have Antonelli, Behrman, Gasly, Sainz. So you get the B tier drivers that look good. Key one is Antonelli there. McLaren and Mercedes, the two meta constructors that we like in our teams right now, key to this team as well. And the best part is, even if you don't have around 125 million to fit this team, you just go Antonelli down to Hadjar, and then you've got the base for another team that you could potentially push for. I just really like it in the sense of when you only have 180 a driver, it's nice going for someone like a Norris, but you're basically set to lose out on points to anyone who has more budget. So this late into the season, again, it's that last little push. This is what I would go for if you wanted a little bit of a differential and you didn't have the budget elsewhere.
I'm thinking especially for the Russell's Rivals mini league, you need to do something weird. If you look back at some of the other mini leagues we've had this season, you can't just go with the classical lineup like our flavor of the week we showed a few minutes ago. You've got to get weird, and I think this team is strong and weird enough to get you up those standings. We're back for our Las Vegas deadline stream this Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern, 3 a.m. Saturday GMT. Sorry, Zach.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough one to be awake, but we'll rise and grind, so we'll be fine.
Thanks so much for watching.
Take care, everyone.